Hi everybody, Steve here, and I just want to talk about the film Adaptation, which we're looking at in the course. This is the Spike Jonze film made in 2002. And the point of looking at all of these films is to look at Leach's different modes. So I just want to look at what mode this applies to. And it really applies to the mode of deconstruction. And it's a perfect example of Leach's mode of deconstruction. Now, this is all a bit confusing. Week 2, I'll be sort of mapping through Leach's chapter and looking at all of his different modes. But as this film certainly speaks to a particular mode, I thought it would be good just to introduce the mode of deconstruction. And deconstruction are generally films about adaptations. They're films that speak directly to the process of adaptations. So the whole idea is that they're deconstructing an adaptation on the screen. So a lot of those making of movies are good examples of deconstructions. There's an Al Pacino film which he directed which is called Looking for Richard, where they're trying to adapt Richard III. And what you've got is a bunch of actors sitting around, Al Pacino, Winona Ryder, Alec Baldwin, and they're talking about how do we adapt this work on the stage. And the whole film is a documentary of them talking about how you adapt a film on the stage. And those kinds of films are good examples of deconstructions, when filmmakers and actors are just sitting around talking about how you adapt a work. Adaptation is kind of interesting because those films are very much non-fiction. They're very much a documentary. But adaptation, it's kind of blurring between fiction. And what it's doing is it's actually taking real life actors who are playing versions of themselves, but it's kind of taking you into this fictional hyper reality kind of world that doesn't seem to be real. Nicolas Cage is playing the screenwriter who wrote the film, so everything's kind of getting blurred, and I think that's what makes it such a fascinating sort of example of deconstruction, that here is a film that's actually talking about adapting a work, but then losing itself in its own fiction and sort of getting lost in its own fiction. Deconstruction often asks the problems involved in adapting. Okay, and that's a good indication of whether a film is deconstruction. Whether on the screen people are actually saying, how do you adapt this work? How do you actually do this adaptation? So basically, adaptation, the film, it sort of details the process of the screenwriter Charlie Kaufman attempting to adapt an unadaptable text, which is The Orchid Thief, right? And the whole idea is you can't really adapt this. So Kaufman, in the film played by Nicolas Cage, is going through this kind of nervous breakdown over how do you actually do this? How do you actually meet a deadline? So all of the industrial issues come in, financing, stars, and all of that. Deconstruction isn't so much interested in the source of adaptation, but instead asking the question, how does one adapt this? So if you look at adaptation, it's not really that interested in what's being adapted. It's actually interested in asking the question, how do you adapt this? And if you look at the documentary Looking for Richard, it's the same thing. They're not really that concerned in the actual text. They're just interested in the question of how do we actually adapt this work. So the thing about adaptation which is interesting is Charlie Kaufman gives Nicolas Cage his own name, and so Nicolas Cage doesn't become a sort of a fictional person that only exists in the vacuum of this film. Charlie Kaufman is a real guy, and there is Nicolas Cage on the screen playing him, which is really interesting. Deconstruction is also often about the idea of celebrity, and what you actually have in a lot of these films are celebrities playing hyper versions of themselves. So in this film, you've got Nicolas Cage playing Charlie Kaufman, Meryl Streep, Chris Cooper. They're all kind of playing hyper versions of their actual selves, which is really interesting. And the problem, I guess, of deconstruction, the reason why some people don't like deconstruction is for people who like to be swept away in fiction, and you can kind of lose yourself for a couple of hours. You're not going to like this sort of film, because this is deconstruction. Deconstruction is like a documentary where it's saying, hey, we're a movie. It's constantly reminding you of that. And what adaptation is constantly doing is it's talking directly to you, and it's actually saying, we're just kind of a silly story. And some people might really like that, others won't like that, but that's essentially what adaptation is interested in doing. Okay, so just some questions to consider when you're watching the film, and we can take these into the classroom, is how and why is this an adaptation? How do you read something as an adaptation when you haven't read the source? So I'm assuming most of you haven't read The Orchid Thief. How do you actually read it as adaptation if you haven't read the source? How is this adaptation? What effect do the real life stars have to the believability of the narrative? Okay, are they a distraction to the narrative? Do you believe the narrative more because Meryl Streep's there and Chris Cooper's there? Roger Ebert said of this film, to watch the film is to be actively involved in the challenge of its creation. Now, what is that? What does he actually mean by that? To be actively involved in the challenge of its creation. So the questions I'll leave you is how does the film make the consumer or audience feel like the producer of the work? Right? How do you actually feel like you're not just watching a movie, but you're actually involved in the process of the movie? And think here of perspective and of point of view and what is actually going on, and where Spike Jonze puts you as an audience member in the head of Charlie Kaufman. All right, I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoy Adaptation. It's a real hoot of a film.